In January 2023, Annie Steward sat beside her sister's hospice bed in her living room, watching as Katie's breathing gradually slowed. The sisters had always shared an extraordinary bond throughout their lives. Born exactly 365 days apart, they had experienced parallel life events with uncanny synchronicity. From identical surgeries performed by brothers who were doctors to getting their ears pierced simultaneously without planning it, their connection transcended ordinary sibling relationships. "We were very close," Annie would later explain. "We looked alike, sounded alike, we were each other's other half." 10 years earlier, Katie had been diagnosed with cancer. Given just 3 years to live, she had chosen to forego conventional treatments like chemotherapy and radiation. Through their combined efforts, researching alternatives late into the night, Katie had survived a decade beyond her prognosis. But now, after weeks in hospice care in Annie's Florida home, both sisters knew the inevitable was approaching. The mourning of Katie's passing began like many others during those final weeks. Annie's friend Arnold, an ICU nurse who had been staying to help, kissed Annie goodbye at around 7 a.m. before heading home. Annie noticed a tear rolling down Katie's cheek as Arnold left, despite her unresponsive state. It was a small but significant sign that Katie remained aware even as her body failed. Left alone with her sister, Annie experienced a moment of apprehension. She had never been present for someone's passing and wasn't sure what to expect or how to help. She briefly sat on the couch feeling overwhelmed before an indescribable urge pulled her back to Katie's side. As she stood to return to the bed, Annie saw something unusual on the floor. Bright numbers, 842, illuminated against the carpet. Unable to process this strange occurrence with everything happening, she moved forward, lowering the railing on Katie's hospital bed and positioning herself to place her head on the pillow next to her sister's. What happened next would transform Annie's understanding of life, death, and the connections that bind us beyond physical existence. Annie found herself humming an old African lullaby that their father had sung to them as children in South Africa. One particular memory surfaced when Katie, around 3 years old, had been stung by a sea critter. Their father had placed her on his shoulders, jogging down the beach while singing this same lullaby to comfort her. Annie hadn't thought of this melody in decades, yet now it flowed from her naturally, as if it carried on a stream directly into Katie's ear. As she continued humming, Annie noticed something extraordinary. Her living room was disappearing. The familiar surroundings faded away, replaced by a light grey environment that resembled wet beach sand. The sounds of her home, the cats meowing from their separated rooms, the dog snoring, all vanished. She could only perceive herself and Katie from the shoulders up. Even the top of the hospital bed was gone. In an instant, without any sensation of movement or transition, Annie and Katie were standing on a dirt road. The path curved slightly, without potholes or stones, stretching into the distance. Katie stood at Annie's right, and Annie could sense her sister's anxiety. Along the sides of the road grew plants and flowers in muted pastel colours. That would make a wonderful photograph, Annie thought, her photographer's instinct momentarily surfacing. Immediately the colours disappeared. The plants remained, but Annie understood she was no longer being shown their colours. A gentle nudge to keep her focus on Katie rather than the surrounding beauty. Instinctively, Annie knew what to do. She told Katie telepathically that she could stand without pain now. Katie tested this by bouncing slightly from one foot to another, and Annie felt her sister's relief and joy. The cancer that had ravaged her body for years no longer limited her here. "We need to walk down this road," Annie told her sister. "There's a gate at the end where we need to go." Later, Annie would wonder how she had known these things. Despite never having experienced anything like this before, she felt certain about what needed to happen and what she needed to say. Katie responded with what had become her familiar phrase during her final months, "Give me a minute." It was her way of asking for time to process things, whether from physical pain or emotional overwhelm. Annie assured her there was no rush. As they moved down the road, Annie communicated gently with Katie about how important she had been, expressing gratitude for their shared journey through life. Their conversation flowed telepathically, without spoken words, but with complete understanding. Halfway down the path, Katie stopped abruptly. "Annie, I'd rather stay here with you," she said. Annie responded with honesty and compassion. "I would love that, but you can't. We can't stop in the middle of this road. We can't go backward or sideways. The only way is forward." This moment gave Annie another opportunity to express her deep appreciation for her sister, telling her how incredible she had been throughout their lives together and thanking her for everything. After absorbing these words, Katie simply said, "Okay, we can go on." As they continued, Annie could see Katie's posture becoming more upright, her spirits lifting. She began telling Katie about what awaited them ahead. Through the bars of the gate, Annie could see figures waiting. Though they appeared somewhat like minimalist drawings rather than fully detailed people, Annie recognised them. "Look, you can see Mum through the bars and Dad," Annie told her sister, naming some of the figures. Katie tensed again, and Annie understood her concern. Katie had always valued her independence and control over her life. She didn't want to be fetched or taken away. She wanted agency in this transition as she'd had in life. "Don't worry," Annie reassured her. "They won't come get you. They're all standing with their hands at their sides. You have to reach for them before they'll respond to you. This is on your time, when you are ready." Annie felt Katie relax at these words. They approached within 6 to 8 feet of the gate, and Annie could now see more clearly who was waiting. She continued identifying people for Katie, their parents, family members, friends, and others Katie had known throughout her life. Annie explained that to open the gate, Katie simply needed to lift her hand, like raising it in a classroom. "But before you do that," Annie added, "I need to take one step back from you. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be with you all the way, but I need to stand just one step behind you." Again, Annie marvelled at how she knew these specific instructions. Following her guidance, Katie asked, "Can I look at you one last time?" "Yes, of course," Annie replied. Katie turned almost completely around and looked at Annie. In this moment, the colours returned. Annie could see Katie's brown hair, her bright blue eyes, and her healthy skin colour. Katie looked restored, vibrant and well again, as she had been before cancer had claimed her body. But her gaze quickly returned to the gate and those waiting beyond it. After a few moments of looking at the gathering, Katie asked, "Can I wave at you one more time?" "Of course you can," Annie told her. Katie raised her left hand in what Annie recognised as her sister's distinctive, slightly crooked wave. As that hand came down, her right hand extended forward toward the people behind the gate. With a jaunty, excited walk, starkly different from her pain-restricted movements of recent years, Katie approached the gate. She lifted her hand as Annie had instructed, and the gate slid open, disappearing into the left pillar rather than swinging outward. Beyond stood a crowd of people, their parents, their nephew Matthew, who had taken his own life 2 years earlier, and numerous friends and family members. Some faces Annie knew well, others she recognised but couldn't quite place, like encountering someone familiar in a store but being unable to recall from where. Matthew particularly caught Annie's attention. Unlike the others who stood quietly waiting, he leaned forward with an enormous grin, his excitement unmistakable. Annie could almost hear his thoughts. "My Auntie Kate's coming! My Auntie Kate's coming!" As Katie crossed between the gateposts and reached the gathering, everyone responded, surrounding her in welcome. Annie noticed that throughout this entire experience, none of the people on the other side had looked at her. Their focus remained entirely on Katie. Yet this didn't feel like exclusion to Annie. It felt appropriate and beautiful that this moment was completely about her sister. Annie observed that Katie never looked back again after joining the others. Rather than feeling abandoned, Annie experienced profound joy in recognising that her sister no longer needed her. Katie was free, whole, and embraced by those who had gone before. As Annie watched, she noticed what looked like a wavy line, almost like a hair, between the gateposts. This line split and widened, and the entire scene, Katie, the gathering, the gateposts, drifted away into a hazy mist. Annie sensed this mist might have been light blue, though again she couldn't perceive the colour directly. As the vision faded, Annie heard a voice, not male or female, not from any particular source, but from everywhere at once. That was a job well done. There was no emotion in the voice, just a simple acknowledgement that Annie accepted without question or surprise. The road where Annie stood melted away into mistiness. She found herself in what felt like a pull-off area to the left of where the road had been. From there she watched as a formless mist approached her. This mist enveloped Annie, holding her upright. Though she didn't experience the overwhelming love that many near-death experiences describe, she felt deeply peaceful. It felt as if scattered parts of herself were being gathered and reassembled, not changed, but somehow healed and made whole. After an indeterminate time in this cocoon-like state, Annie felt a pop sensation, not a sound but a feeling, like breaking through a thin membrane. Instantly she was back in her living room, her head still on the pillow next to Katie's. The house had returned around her. She could hear the dog snoring on the couch and the cats meowing again. Annie noticed it was light outside now, though it had been dark when Arinal left. Looking up at the clock on the wall, she saw it read 8:42, the same numbers she had seen illuminated on the floor earlier. As she looked back down at her sister, Katie exhaled her final breath against Annie's face. The experience had lasted approximately an hour and 40 minutes, though it had seemed both fleeting and eternal to Annie. She needed several days to begin processing what had happened, eventually writing down every detail while it remained fresh in her memory. This wasn't Annie's first encounter with unexplainable phenomena. A month earlier, while Katie was still in hospice care, Annie had experienced a near-death event herself after an allergic reaction to antibiotics. Rushed to the hospital in anaphylactic shock, she had found herself looking down on Katie from ceiling height, surrounded by the same grey environment she would later encounter during this shared death experience. During that earlier episode, Annie had witnessed a question form within herself. What happens if I die now? The answer had come from everywhere at once. Don't worry, she'll be fine. Everything will be okay. Later, she learned she had accurately perceived details of her home while physically unconscious in the hospital, including the unusual position of Ironal sitting in the middle of the couch rather than her customary end seat. There had been other signs of their extraordinary connection as well. On several occasions in the weeks before Katie's passing, Annie had experienced her sister's presence merging with her own while showering, a phenomenon so startling that she eventually had to ask Katie to stop because it was too overwhelming. Looking back, Annie came to understand these experiences as preparation for the final journey they would share. The shower incidents had established their ability to merge consciousness, explaining how Annie could so perfectly understand Katie's thoughts and feelings during their walk down the road. A week before Katie passed, she had tearfully told Annie, "I have this really strong feeling that there's going to be two of us going." At the time, Annie had reassured her sister she wasn't planning to die, but in retrospect, she realised Katie had sensed their upcoming shared transition. In the months following Katie's death, Annie continued to receive confirmations that her sister remained connected to her. One morning, Annie woke to Katie's insistent voice telling her to go to the beach to see dolphins. Despite her reluctance to get up early, Annie felt compelled to follow this directive. At the beach, she encountered an unprecedented number of dolphins, visible continuously through her hour-long walk. Standing in the water watching them, she distinctly heard the words, "I miss you, girl. I will always love you." Though not in Katie's voice, Annie later discovered they came from a journey song playing at a distant beach restaurant. Meaningful because she and Katie had often spoken about their life journeys together. During another difficult day, when Annie was angrily questioning why her sister had left her alone, Katie's voice clearly responded, "No, Annie, remember last time you left first. Now it's your time to stay and live," Katie told her. This statement stunned Annie for two reasons. First was its clarity. It wasn't a thought or impression, but Katie's actual voice. Second, and more significant, was its content. Katie had adamantly rejected the concept of reincarnation throughout her life, refusing to even discuss the topic and dismissing it as too woo-woo. And yet this message seemed to imply past lives together, something Katie would never have acknowledged while alive. It was certainly not a sentiment Annie would subconsciously conjure up and attribute to her. This contradiction convinced Annie that the communication couldn't have originated from her own thoughts or wishes, making it particularly evidential of Katie's continued consciousness. Later, during a period when Annie hadn't sensed her sister's presence for a while, she called out, asking where Katie had gone. The answer came in Katie's distinctive phrasing, "Because you got this, sis." For Annie Steward, the shared death experience with her sister transformed her understanding of mortality. Though their physical separation remained painful, the knowledge that Katie was whole, happy, and surrounded by loved ones brought profound comfort. "I don't believe there's life after death," Annie would later tell those who asked. "I know it." Perhaps most meaningful to Annie was seeing their nephew Matthew among those greeting Katie, vibrant, joyful, and clearly welcomed despite having passed by his own hand. This confirmed what Annie deeply hoped, that no matter how someone passes, they are embraced with love on the other side. Annie has shared her experience in multiple in-depth interviews available on YouTube, where she discusses additional details and insights gained in the years since Katie's transition. Her willingness to speak openly about these profound encounters has provided many grieving people with hope and a framework for understanding their own unexplained experiences with deceased loved ones. We all have these experiences, Annie emphasises. Pay attention to the things you've dismissed as just weird or coincidental. They might be showing you something important. Through her willingness to share her story, Annie offers a glimpse into the continued connections that transcend physical death. Her account stands as living evidence to the enduring bonds of love that guide us not only through life but beyond it as well.